So we have our types of economists then. We have those who are neoclassical, let's say, versus non-neoclassical. Neoclassicals versus Marxists versus Austrians, institutionalists. There's lots of different economic beliefs out there. And then we've got the microeconomists versus the macroeconomists. Again, our focus here will be on macroeconomics. Our focus will be on neoclassical economics and Keynesian economics. And we're going to focus primarily on making positive economic statements, statements of fact that can be proven true or false. So that's the focus of this course. Neoclassical Keynesian macroeconomics, focusing on positive economic statements. Now, with that in mind, economics as a discipline is, again, a social science, but we actually focus on the scientific method. So the scientific method then basically, you can follow the 5 steps that I outlined for you in the typed up lecture notes or in the textbook. But it's essentially building a model, testing that model, and then adjusting the model as needed to get the as you make hypotheses, testing whether those hypotheses are true or false based on your model that you've developed. Now, economics as a discipline also has a lot of different fields. These would be, even within macroeconomics, you could focus on development economics. You could focus on, you could focus on monetary policy. You could focus on fiscal policy. And within microeconomics, there's even more fields, right? You could focus on public choice theory. You could focus on labor economics. For myself, I do the economics of science, so it's a applied microeconomics field. I focus on the incentive structures around scientific institutions and how researchers do research as a response to incentive structures. Yeah, sounds interesting. For any economy, then, any economy must basically ask itself 3 questions. What is going to be produced? How is it going to be produced? And who is it going to be produced for? It gets exactly at our scarcity issue, right? So we're going to look at what is it that we need to produce, right? We list all the things that we absolutely need, and then you can add some wants in there. Then we actually decide how we're going to organize production to actually produce those goods and services. And then finally we decide who's going to get it. How are we going to actually come up with a system to distribute all that's been produced? Your answer to those questions is going to largely depend on how you organize society. In a market economy like our own, the wants and needs, right, are basically determined by individuals saying that this is what they want and need. The way that we organize production is based on profit maximization, trying to reduce costs to the minimum. And who gets the stuff is basically determined by who can afford it. In a centrally planned economy, right, the government or the, typically in a communist society, the party leaders, they decide who it is, what's going to be produced. They decide how it's going to be produced, and they decide who's going to get it. And they might try to make sure it's distributed fairly. Whereas in a market system, we don't really, in a pure market system, we don't really do fairness, right? We just distribute it based on who can afford it. Now, actually, very few economies are market economies, and very few economies are purely a command economy or a controlled economy. Most economies are mixed, and that just means that they draw elements from both. In the case of the United States, right, we have, in terms of like healthcare, right, healthcare is basically mixed, and for some populations, for some individuals, it's distributed by the government. For others, it's up to individuals to purchase it, right? Whereas in other countries, it's much more the other way, where most of it is from the government, and there's very little that can be purchased privately. What this kind of choice comes down to when we look at market versus non-market-based economies is it comes down to the trade-off that exists between equity and efficiency, of deciding whether we're going to be concerned about whether each individual person has the same amount or whether we're going to focus on doing things in the cheapest fashion. Even though the distribution might be unequitable, at least it will be efficient. Market systems are incredibly unequitable, but they're efficient. Command economies are incredibly equitable, but they tend to be inefficient. Okay, now one of the last concepts I want to cover for this chapter, chapter 1, and your first economic concept would be that of the opportunity cost. So every economist, when they think about whether they're going to do something or not, they would tend to think of their opportunity cost, the highest valued alternative foregone or activity they could have done instead, right? Instead of sitting here and giving you this lecture, I could be sleeping, I could be, at the bars, I could be, grocery shopping, I could be doing an epic road trip. There's a number of things I could be doing, and they all have a value to me in terms of happiness. Or I could even be having a second job, right? And then it would actually have a monetary value. Well, I take into account all of those things, right? And whether I decide to do this video for 1 minute longer or not means I'm then comparing 1 minute more of sleeping I could have received, right? Or 1 minute more I could have worked at a different job, right? And so whenever I'm deciding to do something, I always am thinking about the alternative that I could have been doing instead. The highest valued of those alternatives is my opportunity cost, even if it's not an explicit cost, as it would be in the case of a second job. Even if it's just happiness from sleeping an extra minute longer, that would still be an opportunity cost. Okay, so that notion of the opportunity cost is actually going to be the lead-in then for the second chapter, the production possibilities frontier. And that's where we'll pick it up in chapter 2.